Hello, wanderers. Tonight we journey to the unforgiving fjords of Viking-age Norway, where survival wasn't an adventure. It was a daily negotiation with death itself. Picture a world where warmth is a luxury, where hunger gnaws at your bones through endless winters, and where the gods themselves seem bent on your destruction. Before we begin, lower the brightness on your screen, let the day unclench from your shoulders, and take a moment to get comfy. If you enjoy these journeys into the strange and the ancient, you're welcome to subscribe and share where you're listening from and what hour of the night has found you. Now, close your eyes if you wish, settle into stillness, and let us begin our journey together. Welcome to 9th century Norway, where the Aurora Borealis isn't a tourist attraction. It's a reminder that you live at the edge of the world, and winter wants you dead. You wake up, not because your body's ready, but because something wet and cold has just dripped onto your face from the turf roof above. Congratulations! The snow's melting again, which means your ceiling is now a soggy, slowly disintegrating mess of dirt, grass, and whatever the goats left up there last summer. The smell hits you next. Imagine wet dog, unwashed humans, smoke from a fire that never quite burns right, and the lingering funk of fermented fish from dinner. Now multiply that by 6 months of being trapped in a single room with your family, livestock, and whatever relatives couldn't make it through winter on their own. The Vikings called this lovely aroma the breath of the hall, which tells you everything about how much they enjoyed it. Your bed isn't a bed, by the way. It's a bench built into the wall, padded with whatever furs you could scrape together before the cold set in. If you're lucky, you've got a bearskin. If you're not, you're sleeping under a pile of raggedy sheepskins that smell like, well, sheep. Wet sheep. Dead, wet sheep. You try to stretch and your back immediately reminds you that sleeping on a wooden plank for 8 months straight wasn't designed for human comfort. The Vikings believed that Odin only slept when he was dead. And honestly, after a night on this thing, you're starting to think he had the right idea. The fire in the centre of the room has died down to embers. Again. This happens every single night, because someone, probably your youngest child, was supposed to keep it fed and decided sleep was more important than everyone not freezing to death. Now you get to stumble around in the dark, add wood to the fire pit, and try not to step on anyone else who had the same idea. The smoke from the rekindled fire immediately starts choking you. See, chimneys haven't been invented yet. That's still a few centuries away, so all the smoke has to find its way out through a hole in the roof. When it works, it works. When it doesn't, your house becomes a gas chamber with rustic charm. You can taste the smoke in your throat, feel it burning your eyes. The Vikings had a saying, better to weep from smoke than freeze from cold, which really tells you how much they were enjoying their housing situation. And speaking of cold, the temperature inside your house is maybe 10 degrees warmer than outside. Maybe. If the wind isn't blowing directly through the gaps in your walls, which it always is, you can see your breath inside your own home. Your fingers are already going numb just from getting dressed, which involves wrapping yourself in layer after layer of wool and linen and fur until you look like a walking haystack. But wait, there's more. You need to use the bathroom. The privy is outside, in the snow, in the wind, and you get to make this delightful journey every single morning because your bladder doesn't care that it's negative 20 degrees outside. The Vikings believed that Loki, the trickster god who's basically a cosmic force of inconvenience, personally designed winter mornings to test human endurance. Modern translation: getting up to pee when it's this cold feels like divine punishment for existing. So you've managed to not die in your sleep. Time for breakfast. What's on the menu? Well, if you're lucky, some leftover bread from yesterday that's now hard enough to use as a weapon. The Vikings actually had a word for bread this hard: toothbreaker. They weren't being poetic. But first, you need to make fire again. Yes, again. The embers aren't enough to cook with, so you get to strike flint against steel until your hands cramp up, and you've used enough patience to power a small monastery. Every morning, for months. The Norse god of fire was called Logi, literally flame, and the myths say he could consume anything. Which makes sense because getting fire to stay lit in this climate requires divine intervention. Your breakfast options are basically porridge, or, if you're feeling adventurous, porridge with some dried fish mixed in. The grain for this porridge has been stored in a barrel since harvest, which means it's probably got weevils, little protein-packed weevils that add that special crunch to your morning meal. The Vikings called them grain guests, which is optimistic, considering they're basically just bugs eating your food. The porridge itself tastes like boiled sadness with a texture somewhere between paste and grout. You eat it because you have to, not because you want to. Every spoonful is an exercise in swallowing your gag reflex and pretending that lumpy grey mush counts as food. Your wife stirs the pot with a wooden spoon that's seen better decades, adding water from a bucket that's probably grown some interesting bacterial cultures overnight. But wait, where's the milk for your porridge? Oh right, it's winter. The cows aren't producing milk because they're too busy not dying of cold to worry about your dairy needs. So you get to eat your porridge with water, maybe a splash of yesterday's ale if you're lucky, or, if you're really desperate, melted snow that tastes like whatever the roof collected over the past month. The bread situation isn't much better. What passes for bread is basically barley and oats ground into flour with a stone quern, a hand mill that's about as efficient as it sounds. You spend an hour every few days grinding grain by hand, getting flour that's full of grit from the grinding stones. This means your bread tastes like it's been seasoned with sand, and eating it slowly files down your teeth. The Vikings thought tooth pain was caused by toothworms, tiny creatures that burrowed into your teeth and gnawed on the roots, which honestly makes about as much sense as any other explanation when you're eating bread that could double as mortar. Your children are crying because they're hungry and cold and tired of eating the same grey mush every single day for months. Your wife is trying to make the porridge stretch by adding more water, which just makes it taste more like hot sadness. Everyone's looking at everyone else wondering if this winter will ever end, if the stored food will last, if spring will come before you all lose your minds from eating flavourless paste day after day after day. And this is if you're having a good morning. Now that you've choked down breakfast, it's time for the day's work, which, in winter, mostly involves desperately trying to keep everyone and everything alive until spring decides to show up. If you're a farmer, and most Vikings were farmers when they weren't off pillaging monasteries, winter work means maintenance, repairs, and constantly fighting a losing battle against entropy. First up, checking on the livestock. Your cows, sheep and goats are huddled together in a part of your house called the byre, basically a barn attached to your living space. This keeps them from freezing to death, which is good, but it also means you're sharing your home with animals that have strong opinions about personal hygiene. The smell is indescribable. Imagine a gas station bathroom combined with a petting zoo, then aged for several months in a humid, poorly ventilated space. The animals are hungry. Of course they're hungry. You've been feeding them hay that you cut and stored last summer, but your calculations were optimistic, and winter was longer than expected. Aren't they always? So now you get to ration hay while watching your cattle get thinner, and your sheep develop that hollow-eyed look that says they're questioning their life choices. Your prize bull, the one you've been counting on for spring breeding, has developed a cough. In your modern life, you'd call a vet. Here, you get to watch and hope and maybe sacrifice something to Freya, the Norse god of fertility and prosperity. Freya was supposedly responsible for keeping livestock healthy, though judging by your bull's condition, either Freya isn't listening, or he's got higher priorities right now. The goats are doing better than the cattle, but that's because goats are basically the teenagers of the animal kingdom. They'll eat anything, survive on nothing, and cause maximum chaos in the process. You find one of them chewing on your spare leather harness, which you need for spring ploughing, assuming you make it to spring, assuming your ox doesn't die, assuming the harness is still functional after the goat finishes using it as breakfast. But wait, there's more fun to be had. Time to muck out the stalls. Yes, even in winter, animals keep producing manure, and you get to shovel it out unless you want your house to become uninhabitable, even by Viking standards. You wade through ankle-deep muck that's frozen solid on top and disturbingly squishy underneath, using a wooden shovel to chip and scrape and haul it all outside to a pile that's taller than you are. This manure pile is actually valuable. It's fertilizer for next year's crops. But right now, it's just another thing that wants to make your life miserable. It steams in the cold air, creating its own little weather system of stink and condensation. The Norse called these piles Jord's gold, Jord being the goddess of earth and fertility, which sounds poetic until you realise they're calling a mountain of frozen poop gold. This tells you everything about how Vikings valued their fertilizer. The pile also attracts rats. Lots of rats. Big, confident rats that look at you like they're wondering why you're disturbing their breakfast buffet. These aren't the cute little field mice you might see in a Disney movie. These are Viking rats, tough, resourceful, and completely unimpressed by your attempts to shoo them away. They've been surviving northern European winters longer than your family has, and they know it. Just when you think you've got a handle on the morning routine, you step outside to check on the rest of your farm. The wind immediately tries to murder you. This isn't a gentle breeze or even a stiff wind. This is a meteorological assault that feels like the atmosphere has personal beef with your continued existence. The temperature is somewhere around, if you spit, it freezes before it hits the ground. But the wind makes it feel like, if you breathe wrong, your lungs will turn to ice. Your eyes start watering immediately, and then those tears freeze on your cheeks. Your nose begins running, and then that freezes too. Within minutes, you look like you're wearing a mask made of your own bodily fluids, which is exactly as attractive as it sounds. The Vikings believed this kind of weather was caused by the Jötuns, frost giants who lived in the mountains and had nothing better to do than make human life miserable. The wind was specifically the breath of Hrimgrimnir, a frost giant whose name literally means frost-masked, which tells you that even the Vikings thought having your face frozen solid wasn't a good look. Your fingers go numb first, then your toes, then your ears. You're wearing mittens, but they're wool mittens that are already soaking up moisture from the air and slowly turning into ice sculptures attached to your hands. The cold seeps through your boots, leather boots that seemed adequate when you were inside, but now feel like they're made of tissue paper and wishful thinking. You need to check your fence lines because the snow has been drifting, and you need to make sure your livestock boundaries are still intact. This involves wading through snow that's sometimes ankle-deep, sometimes waist-deep, and occasionally deep enough that you disappear entirely and have to dig yourself out like you're escaping from a very cold, very white prison. Every step is a gamble. Is this snow solid enough to hold your weight, or will you punch through and find yourself hip-deep in a drift, with snow going down your boots and up your tunic, and generally making you question every life choice that led to this moment? The answer is usually the latter. You spend more time digging yourself out of snow than actually walking through it. And then there's the wind again. It doesn't just blow, it howls, it screams. It makes sounds like a banshee having a particularly bad day. The Norse thought this was the sound of the wild hunt, a ghostly procession led by Odin himself, riding across the sky with a pack of supernatural hounds. Basically, they believed the winter wind was literally death itself passing overhead, which explains why it sounds so cheerful. The cold doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it actively tries to kill you. Your body starts shutting down blood flow to your extremities to keep your core warm, which means your hands and feet stop working properly. You become clumsy, slow, stupid, you make mistakes, you drop things. You can't feel your fingers well enough to tie knots or grip tools properly. This is when accidents happen. You slip on ice and crack your head open. You can't feel your feet and step into a hole and break your ankle. You can't grip your axe handle properly, and it flies out of your hands and nearly takes your head off. The cold doesn't just make you miserable, it makes you dangerous to yourself and everyone around you. Speaking of accidents, let's talk about what happens when you get hurt. Spoiler alert, you're not calling 911. You're not going to an emergency room. You're not even getting a sprint. You get to deal with pain the Viking way, which mostly involves suffering in silence and hoping you don't die. Cut yourself with an axe? Time for some battlefield surgery courtesy of your wife, who's hopefully seen this kind of thing before. The treatment involves cleaning the wound with whatever you've got handy, usually ale or water, then binding it up with cloth and praying to the gods that it doesn't get infected. The Norse god of healing was Air, a goddess who supposedly had magical healing powers, though she seems to have been taking a long vacation during the winter months when you actually need her. Infection wasn't just a possibility, it was practically inevitable. You live in a world where everything is dirty, no one washes their hands because they don't know germs exist, and your first aid kit consists of whatever cloth isn't currently being used for something else. A simple cut can turn septic, start oozing pus, develop red streaks running up your arm, and generally remind you that your immune system is fighting a battle it's probably going to lose. The Vikings had some interesting theories about disease. They thought illness was caused by elves shooting invisible arrows at you, literally called elf shot. So when you got sick, you weren't dealing with bacteria or viruses. You were under attack by supernatural archers with apparently unlimited ammunition and questionable target selection. The treatment for elf shot involved various charms, herbs and rituals that were about as effective as you'd expect when you're trying to cure pneumonia with folk magic. Fever was considered a sign that fire giants had invaded your body. Chills meant ice giants had moved in instead. Headaches were caused by dwarfs mining in your skull. The Vikings had basically turned disease into a Norse mythology greatest hits album, which would be charming if people weren't actually dying from these conditions. And speaking of dying, let's talk about what winter does to your body even when you're not sick or injured. The lack of sunlight means you're not getting enough vitamin D, so your bones start getting soft and bendy. Your teeth start falling out from scurvy because fresh vegetables are a summer memory. Your hair falls out in clumps. Your skin cracks and bleeds in the dry air. You develop chilblains, painful swellings on your fingers and toes from repeated exposure to cold. They itch, they burn, they crack open and bleed. The Vikings called them frostbite kisses, which makes them sound romantic until you realize they're talking about tissue damage that can lead to gangrene and amputation. Your joints ache constantly from the cold and damp. Your back spasms from sleeping on wooden benches and doing heavy labor in freezing temperatures. Your muscles cramp from poor nutrition and constant shivering. You wake up every morning feeling like you've been beaten with clubs, which is basically what winter does to the human body. It beats you up slowly, methodically, day after day, until spring finally calls a timeout. If you thought surviving a Norwegian winter as a male farmer was challenging, try doing it as a woman in the same period. Congratulations. You get to do everything we just described, plus a whole additional layer of medieval fun that makes the regular hardships look like a vacation. First, you're expected to manage the household while your husband is off farming, trading, or raiding. This means you're responsible for keeping everyone alive, fed, clothed, and reasonably clean during the months when these tasks range from difficult to impossible. You're the one rationing food, making sure the fire doesn't go out, treating injuries and illnesses with whatever herbs and folk remedies you can remember, and somehow making a single room livable for an extended family plus livestock. But here's the extra special part: you're also expected to produce children, preferably male children, preferably healthy ones, preferably without dying in the process. Pregnancy during a Norwegian winter is essentially a 9-month exercise in malnutrition, vitamin deficiency, and physical stress. You're growing a human while living on porridge and dried fish, sleeping on wooden planks, breathing smoke-filled air, and doing heavy physical labor in sub-freezing temperatures. The infant mortality rate was somewhere around 50%, and maternal mortality wasn't much better. Childbirth happened at home, obviously, attended by whatever women in the community had experience with the process. No anesthesia, no antiseptics, no emergency medical procedures if something went wrong. You got to experience medieval obstetrics, which basically involved hoping really hard that everything would work out fine, and having a backup plan that consisted of praying to Frigg, the goddess of motherhood, who was apparently too busy to prevent the majority of pregnancy-related deaths. The Norse believed that women who died in childbirth went to Folkvanger, a special hall where they could fight and feast like warriors. Which sounds nice, until you realise this was basically their way of saying, "We expect so many of you to die giving birth that we've created a separate afterlife just for maternal mortality." So, you've survived the morning routine, endured the weather's personal vendetta against your existence, and somehow avoided dying from medieval medicine. Congratulations, now it's time for the main event. Figuring out what you're going to eat today that won't kill you. Spoiler alert, your options are limited, unappetizing, and occasionally toxic. Let's start with the obvious question. Where exactly does food come from in the middle of a Norwegian winter, when nothing grows and hunting requires you to track animals that are smarter, faster, and better adapted to this climate than you are? The answer is, whatever you manage to preserve, store, or ferment before the cold set in. And if your preservation game was weak, well, you get to discover exactly how creative hunger can make you. Your main protein source is fish. Lots and lots of fish. Specifically fish that's been dried, salted, fermented, or otherwise transformed into something that technically qualifies as food, but bears only a passing resemblance to what you'd recognize as edible. The Vikings perfected the art of making fish last through winter, which mostly involved making it so unpalatable that even bacteria wouldn't touch it. Take lutefisk, for example. This delightful dish starts with perfectly good dried cod, which you then soak in lye. Yes, the same caustic substance used to make soap, until it develops the consistency of fish-flavoured jello and a smell that could clear a longhouse. The process takes weeks and involves multiple steps that seem designed to remove any trace of flavour, nutrition, or dignity from the original fish. The Vikings called this life-giving sustenance, which tells you everything about their relationship with food. But lutefisk isn't your only fishy option. There's also hakal, fermented shark meat that's been buried in the ground for several months until it reaches the perfect combination of ammonia fumes and putrid texture. The fermentation process removes the toxins that make fresh shark meat poisonous, replacing them with a flavour profile that makes you question whether poisoning might have been preferable. The Norse god Aegir was supposedly the master of the sea and all its creatures, though judging by Hakal, either his taste buds were broken or he had a very dark sense of humour. Then there's the bread situation we touched on earlier. What passes for bread in your house is made from whatever grain you could scrape together before winter. Barley, oats, maybe some rye if you were lucky. But here's the thing about grain storage in medieval Norway. It attracts everything. Mice, rats, insects, mould, and various fungi that turn your flour into a biological experiment you definitely don't want to eat. The ergot fungus is particularly fun. It grows on rye and looks harmless enough, but eating ergot-contaminated bread gives you hallucinations, convulsions, and a condition called St. Anthony's fire. Anthony's fire, where your extremities feel like they're burning and sometimes actually fall off. The Vikings didn't know about ergot specifically, but they knew that sometimes the grain made people crazy, which they attributed to being cursed by the Jotuns, frost giants who apparently had nothing better to do than contaminate food supplies. Your vegetable situation is even more depressing. Root vegetables like turnips and onions, if you manage to store them properly in your root cellar. And by root cellar, we mean a hole in the ground covered with stones and dirt, which keeps things cool but also creates the perfect environment for rot, mould, and whatever else wants to move into your food storage. The turnips have developed soft spots, wrinkled skin, and a suspicious smell. The onions are sprouting green shoots and feel squishy when you squeeze them. Half your stored vegetables are completely rotten and need to be thrown out, which means your winter food supply just got smaller and your diet just got more monotonous. But wait, there's more. You also have access to whatever dairy products you manage to preserve before your cows stop producing milk. This includes skyr, a kind of fermented cheese that tastes like sour yogurt mixed with regret. The fermentation process was supposed to preserve it, but after several months in storage, Even the sky is developing interesting colours and textures that suggest it's evolving into a new life form. The ale situation deserves special mention. Water isn't safe to drink. It's full of bacteria, parasites, and whatever runoff has collected in your local water source. So you drink ale instead. Weak ale, strong ale, ale that's starting to turn to vinegar, ale that tastes like it was brewed in someone's boot. The Vikings believed that ale was a gift from Odin himself, who stole the secret of brewing from the giants, which explains why it tastes like theft. Your children are constantly hungry because growing bodies need nutrition, and you're feeding them the medieval equivalent of survival rations. They cry when they see the same grey porridge for the third meal in a row. They refuse to eat the fermented fish that smells like a crime scene. They beg for something, anything, that doesn't taste like it's been deliberately designed to test human endurance. And here's the psychological torture of medieval nutrition. You know that spring will bring fresh vegetables, new growth, animals coming out of hibernation ready to be hunted. You know that in just a few months, food will go from technically edible survival paste to actual meals that don't require courage to consume. But those months stretch ahead of you like a prison sentence, and every day you wonder if your food stores will last, if you've calculated wrong, if this might be the winter when hunger finally wins. Now that you've choked down whatever counted as lunch, probably more of that grey porridge with some questionable fish stirred in, it's time to get back to the endless cycle of work that keeps you alive. And we're not talking about the kind of work where you can take coffee breaks or scroll through your phone when the boss isn't looking. This is survival work, where slacking off literally means dying. The afternoon brings its own special challenges. If you're a farmer, winter work means preparing for spring while simultaneously trying not to die during winter. You need to repair tools that broke during harvest season, maintain equipment that's been sitting in the cold for months, and somehow find wood for repairs when every tree in the area is either frozen solid or buried under snow. Your axe handle cracked during the morning wood chopping, so now you get to carve a new one from a piece of birch that's harder than stone and about as cooperative as a drunk goat. This involves hours of patient work with a knife, shaving tiny curls of wood while your hands gradually lose feeling and your back cramps from hunching over the work. The Vikings believed that the best tools were blessed by the dwarfs, master craftsmen who lived underground and forged magical items. Judging by how your current tools are holding up, either the dwarfs are having an off-season, or they've decided your particular axe handle doesn't deserve their attention. But tool repair is just the beginning. You also need to maintain your fishing nets, which means sitting in a poorly lit room trying to mend tiny holes with fingers that barely work in the cold. The thread keeps breaking, the knots won't stay tied, and every time you think you've fixed a section, you discover 3 more holes that somehow appeared while you weren't looking. The nets smell like fish, seaweed, and several months of hard use. They're covered in scales, bits of rotting seaweed, and what might be fish guts, or might be something else entirely. You've learned not to investigate too closely. The stench gets into your clothes, your hair, your skin. You'll smell like low tide for days after working with these nets, but they're essential for spring fishing, so you get to enjoy this aromatic experience whether you want to or not. Then there's leather work. Your boots are falling apart, your harnesses need new straps, and your belt is held together by optimism and religious faith. Working with leather in winter means dealing with materials that are frozen stiff and about as flexible as stone. You have to warm each piece by the fire before you can work with it, then race to complete your repairs before it freezes solid again. The leather awl, a sharp tool for punching holes, requires more force than usual because everything is so stiff. This means more chances to slip and stab yourself, more opportunities to discover that medieval first aid consists mainly of wrapping things in cloth and hoping for the best. Your hands are already raw from cold and previous injuries, so every mistake with the awl becomes a new source of pain and potential infection. Your wife is dealing with her own set of winter work challenges, spinning wool into thread on a spindle that keeps slipping in her numb fingers, weaving cloth on a loom where the tension keeps changing as the materials expand and contract with temperature fluctuations, mending clothes that are being worn constantly and falling apart from hard use, and repeated washing in cold water. The washing situation deserves special mention. Laundry in winter means hauling water from a source that might be frozen, heating it over a fire that doesn't want to burn hot enough, and scrubbing clothes with soap made from animal fat and wood ash. The soap burns your hands. The water is never hot enough to actually clean anything properly, and hanging wet clothes to dry in a smoky room means everything smells like campfire and takes forever to actually dry. Your children are supposed to be helping, but they're children, so mostly they're finding creative ways to make simple tasks more difficult. They drop things, break things, get in the way, and generally demonstrate why child labour laws were eventually invented. The oldest child is responsible for keeping the fire going, which means every few hours you discover the fire has died down to almost nothing, and someone needs to be reminded that warmth isn't optional. The youngest children need constant supervision to keep them from injuring themselves, eating something poisonous, or wandering outside into weather that could kill them in minutes. They're bored, cranky, hungry, and tired of being cooped up inside. They fight with each other, whine about everything, and generally add chaos to an already difficult situation. And through it all, you're constantly aware that spring is still months away. Every broken tool, every depleted supply, every small crisis reminds you that you're operating without a safety net. There's no hardware store to buy replacement parts, no grocery store to supplement your food supplies, no heating repair service to fix your heating system. Everything depends on your ability to maintain, repair, and preserve what you already have, using nothing but hand tools, basic materials, and whatever knowledge you've managed to accumulate. As the short winter day fades into what passes for evening, which in northern Norway during winter means it gets darker rather than just regular dark, you get to enjoy the high-quality entertainment options available to medieval farmers. Spoiler alert, your choices are limited, and they mostly involve sitting in a smoky room trying not to think about how bored you are. The main event is storytelling, not Netflix, not books, not even radio. Just people sitting around the fire sharing the same stories you've heard 100 times before, because oral tradition is literally your only source of entertainment that doesn't require physical effort. Tonight, someone will tell the story of Thor's fishing trip, where he almost caught the world serpent Jörmungandr, a massive snake that encircles the entire world and will eventually cause Ragnarok, the end of everything. It's a great story the first dozen times you hear it. By the 50th telling, you're starting to sympathize with the serpent, or maybe you'll get the tale of Loki turning into a mare, getting pregnant by a stallion, and giving birth to Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse, which is exactly as weird as it sounds, and raises questions about Norse mythology that nobody really wants to explore too deeply. These stories served multiple purposes: entertainment, cultural education, and presumably explaining why their gods were so dysfunctional. The Norse called these tales the word hoard, treating stories like treasure, which makes sense when you realize that stories were literally the only free entertainment available. But storytelling requires someone who actually knows the stories well enough to tell them engagingly. If you're stuck with Uncle Olaf, whose memory isn't what it used to be, and whose storytelling skills peaked sometime during the previous century, you get to enjoy rambling, incomplete narratives that start somewhere, wander around aimlessly, and end with, or maybe that was a different Thor. Who can remember? When the stories run out, you get to enjoy the thrilling activity of staring at the fire and thinking about things. What things? Well, you can contemplate whether your food will last until spring, whether that cough your son developed is serious, whether the roof will collapse under the weight of accumulated snow, whether wolves will get into your livestock shelter, whether the cold snap will kill your fruit trees, or whether this winter will finally be the one that breaks your family's string of survival luck. The fire itself becomes a form of entertainment out of sheer desperation. You watch the flames dance, the embers glow, the smoke swirl toward the ceiling. You become fascinated by the way different types of wood burn, the colours of the flames, the shapes they make. This is what passes for television when your other options are staring at walls or having the same conversations you've been having every night for months. Speaking of conversations, let's talk about the social dynamics of being trapped in a single room with the same people for months on end. Everyone's personal habits become magnified. Your brother-in-law's tendency to clear his throat constantly becomes a source of murderous rage. Your mother's habit of humming under her breath turns into psychological torture. The way your youngest child chews food becomes grounds for reconsidering your stance on infanticide. Privacy doesn't exist. You can hear everyone breathing, snoring, moving around, digesting food, and performing various bodily functions that are much more noticeable when you're all sharing the same small space. The concept of personal space becomes meaningless when there literally isn't enough space for everyone to have their own area. Arguments break out over trivial things because trivial things become enormous when you're stressed, cold, hungry, and bored out of your mind. Someone ate the last piece of decent bread. Someone used more than their share of firewood. Someone's breathing too loudly. These disputes can escalate quickly because everyone's nerves are frayed, and there's nowhere to go to cool off. The Norse had elaborate rules about hospitality and social behaviour, probably because they recognized that people trapped together for months needed clear guidelines to avoid killing each other. The concept of guest right meant that anyone who entered your home was under your protection, but it also meant they had to follow your house rules. Which makes sense when you realize that one disruptive person could make an already difficult living situation completely unbearable. But here's the thing about medieval boredom. It's not like modern boredom where you can't find anything interesting on TV or social media. This is existential boredom that comes from having literally nothing to stimulate your mind except the same conversations with the same people about the same problems. Your brain starts creating its own entertainment, which explains why so many medieval people developed rich fantasy lives, elaborate superstitions, and detailed opinions about things that didn't really matter. You find yourself having passionate internal debates about whether the log on the fire looks more like a dragon or a horse. You develop strong preferences for which corner of the room has the best acoustics. You start noticing patterns in the smoke that probably aren't actually there, but give you something to think about besides the fact that you're slowly losing your mind from sensory deprivation and social isolation. Eventually, even the limited entertainment options run out, and it's time for what passes as bedtime in medieval Norway. Which sounds restful until you realize that nighttime in a Viking longhouse is basically an 8-hour endurance test disguised as sleep. First, there's the sleeping arrangements. Remember that wooden bench we talked about earlier? Well, that's still your bed, and it hasn't gotten any more comfortable since this morning. You get to lie down on a surface that would make a park bench feel luxurious, covered by furs that smell like the animals they came from, assuming those animals had particularly strong opinions about personal hygiene. The temperature drops even further once the fire dies down, which it will because someone has to stay awake to keep feeding it, and everyone's too exhausted to volunteer for fire duty. You can actually feel the cold creeping through the walls, through your blankets, through your clothes, settling into your bones like an unwelcome houseguest who's planning to stay all winter. Your breath turns to vapor clouds that hang in the air above your face. The moisture from your breathing starts to freeze on the inside of your fur covers, creating a delightful layer of frost that melts and refreezes throughout the night. It's like sleeping inside a very smelly, very uncomfortable igloo that's slowly trying to freeze you to death. But the cold is just the beginning of your nighttime entertainment. There's also the symphony of sounds that comes with housing multiple families plus livestock in a single building. The cows are chewing cud with the enthusiasm of creatures who've discovered the secret to eternal contentment. The sheep are making those weird sheep noises that sound like they're either very happy or plotting something sinister. The goats are being goats, which means they're probably chewing on something they shouldn't be chewing on and making noise about it. Your family members contribute their own charming sounds to this nocturnal orchestra. Uncle Olaf snores like a hibernating bear with respiratory problems. Your youngest child has developed a cough that sounds like a broken bellows. Your mother-in-law makes small humming noises in her sleep that might be prayers or might be incantations. Honestly, at this point, you're not sure there's a difference. The Norse believed that dreams were visits from the gods, messages from the other world, or glimpses of possible futures, which explains why so many Viking dreams involve violence, monsters, and apocalyptic scenarios. When you're living in conditions like this, even your subconscious is stressed out. The god Balder supposedly had prophetic dreams about his own death, which seems unnecessary since anyone living in medieval Norway could have prophetic dreams about death without divine intervention. Speaking of supernatural visitors, nighttime is when all the really fun mythological creatures come out to play. There are the Draugr, undead creatures who smell like decay and have superhuman strength, basically zombies before zombies were cool. They're supposed to guard treasure, but mostly they just wander around making already difficult nights even more unpleasant. Then there are the mares, not horses, but female spirits who sit on your chest while you sleep and give you nightmares. The word nightmare literally comes from these creatures, which tells you everything about how seriously the Vikings took bad dreams. When you wake up feeling like you've been wrestling with invisible attackers all night, you're not dealing with sleep apnea. You're under assault by supernatural entities with nothing better to do than ruin your rest. The Huldra are forest spirits, who look like beautiful women from the front but have cow tails and hollow backs. They're supposed to seduce men and lead them astray, though honestly, after months of winter isolation, the standards for supernatural seduction have probably dropped considerably. Any entity offering to take you away from your current living situation might start looking attractive, cowtail or not. But the real nighttime terror isn't supernatural. It's perfectly natural and much more dangerous. House fires. Your entire home is basically a wooden box, filled with flammable materials, heated by an open fire, and occupied by people who are too tired and cold to be properly careful. One spark landing in the wrong place, one person knocking over an oil lamp, one child getting too close to the fire pit, and your shelter becomes your funeral pyre. The Norse god Logi wasn't just the personification of fire, he was also a reminder that fire could consume everything you owned in minutes. Norse sagas are full of stories about people being burned alive in their homes, usually by enemies, but sometimes just by accidents. When your heating system is literally an open flame in the middle of a wooden room, fire safety becomes a matter of constant vigilance and good luck. Now, we need to talk about something that doesn't get mentioned much in the romantic Viking narratives, the psychological toll of surviving a northern European winter. This isn't just about being cold and hungry. This is about what happens to your mind when you're trapped in darkness for months at a time, isolated from the outside world, and constantly stressed about survival. In northern Norway, winter days are short, like really short. We're talking about maybe 4 hours of actual daylight during the darkest months, and even that daylight is more like extended twilight. The sun barely creeps above the horizon before it starts setting again, and for weeks at the northernmost settlements, it doesn't rise at all. You're living in a world of perpetual darkness broken only by firelight and whatever weak illumination you can create with oil lamps. This constant darkness does things to your brain. Modern science calls it seasonal affective disorder, but the Vikings just called it winter and figured it was normal to feel like the world was ending because, from their perspective, it basically was. Every winter was a small-scale Ragnarok, the end of the world that would maybe, hopefully, be followed by renewal and rebirth when spring finally arrived. Your sleep cycle gets completely disrupted because your body can't tell when it's supposed to be awake or asleep. You find yourself staying up all night because there's no visual cue that it's bedtime, then sleeping through half the day because there's no real sunrise to wake you up. The Norse believed that time was controlled by the god Kronos, but during winter, time becomes meaningless. Days blur together into an endless sequence of cold, dark, hungry tedium. The isolation is almost worse than the physical hardships. You're cut off from neighbouring farms by snow, ice and weather that can kill you if you try to travel. Whatever news, gossip, or contact with the outside world you might have had during summer is gone. Your entire universe shrinks down to the people in your immediate household, and you start to forget that there's a world beyond your four walls. This is when cabin fever really sets in. And we're not talking about the mild irritation of being stuck inside during a snow day. This is months of social isolation that can drive people to genuine madness. You start having conversations with yourself. You develop elaborate theories about the behavior of household objects. You begin to suspect that your family members are plotting against you, which they might actually be because they're going just as crazy as you are. The Norse had stories about people who went into the woods during winter and never came back, not because they died, but because they chose madness over returning to their families. They called it going berserk, which originally meant becoming so mentally unstable that you started acting like a wild animal. The berserkers in battle weren't just warriors. They were people who had snapped under psychological pressure and decided that violence was preferable to sanity. Your children start showing signs of stress that would alarm modern child psychologists. They become withdrawn, aggressive, or both. They develop fears about things that don't exist and stop being afraid of things that should terrify them. They regress to earlier developmental stages because their minds are trying to cope with conditions that human beings weren't designed to endure. The adults aren't much better. Depression becomes endemic because there's literally nothing to look forward to except more of the same hardship. Anxiety skyrockets because every small problem might be the beginning of a crisis that kills everyone. Paranoia develops because when you're living on the edge of survival, anyone who makes a mistake or acts selfishly becomes a potential threat to everyone's life. But let's say you somehow manage to survive the psychological gauntlet of winter. Let's say your food stores last, nobody dies from disease or accident, your house doesn't burn down, and you don't go completely insane from months of isolation and darkness. Congratulations. You get to discover that surviving winter was just the first part of your annual struggle with existence. Spring in Viking Norway isn't the gentle awakening you see in temperate climates. It's a violent, chaotic explosion of melting snow, flooding, mud, and sudden weather changes that can kill you just as effectively as winter, but with different methods. The snow that's been accumulating for months suddenly starts melting all at once, turning your carefully ordered world into a swamp of mud, slush, and standing water. Your house, which has been slowly settling and shifting under the weight of snow all winter, now has to deal with melting runoff that finds every weak point in your walls and roof. Water comes pouring through gaps you didn't know existed, turning your floor into a marsh and your belongings into soggy reminders that medieval construction wasn't designed for this kind of abuse. The meltwater has nowhere to go because the ground is still frozen solid underneath the surface. So you get flooding. Lots of flooding. Your carefully maintained drainage systems get overwhelmed. Your storage areas get inundated. And whatever supplies you have left from winter get waterlogged and ruined. The Norse god of spring was Vali, who was supposedly born to avenge his father's death. Which makes sense because spring feels like nature's revenge for having survived winter. But flooding is just the beginning of spring's special challenges. Now you get to deal with mud. Not just regular mud, but the special kind of medieval mud that's been created by months of snow melting into soil that contains the accumulated waste of an entire winter. Animal droppings, human waste, rotting organic matter, and whatever else has been buried under the snow all winter gets mixed into a toxic soup that's ankle-deep everywhere you need to walk. This mud isn't just unpleasant, it's dangerous. It harbours diseases, makes walking treacherous, ruins equipment, and generally turns every outdoor task into a battle against a landscape that seems actively hostile to human habitation. You slip and fall constantly, covering yourself in filth that takes days to properly clean off. Your boots rot from constant exposure to moisture and waste. Your clothes become permanently stained with substances you'd rather not identify. And just when you think you're ready to embrace the return of warmth and light, spring weather decides to remind you that it's still in charge. Temperatures swing wildly from day to day, freezing at night, warm during the day, cold again by evening. You can get frostbite and heat exhaustion in the same 24-hour period. The weather changes so rapidly that you can't dress appropriately for conditions, because the conditions change faster than you can change clothes. The animals that have been cooped up with you all winter suddenly remember that they're supposed to be outdoor creatures. They want to graze, roam, explore, and generally act like livestock instead of roommates. But the outside world isn't ready for them yet. The grass hasn't started growing, the pastures are flooded or muddy, and there's still not enough edible vegetation to support a herd of hungry animals who've been living on stored hay for months. So you get to mediate between animals who are desperate to get outside and an environment that's not ready to support them. You spend your days chasing escaped livestock through mud and standing water, trying to keep them from eating plants that might be poisonous, and generally learning that animal husbandry in early spring is like being a prison warden for creatures who've forgotten that you're the one keeping them alive. But here's the thing about spring in Viking Norway. Despite all the challenges, despite the flooding and mud and chaos, it represents something that's been missing from your life for months. Hope. The days are getting longer. The sun is actually providing warmth instead of just light. Plants are starting to grow again, which means fresh food is coming. The nightmare of winter is finally ending, and you've somehow managed to survive another year in a climate that seems designed to kill human beings. You look around at your family, your livestock, your property, and you take inventory of what made it through and what didn't. Some animals died, some equipment broke, some people got sick and haven't fully recovered. But you're alive. Your family is mostly intact. Spring is here, and that means you get to start the whole cycle over again. Planting crops, raising animals, preparing for next winter, and hoping that maybe this year will be a little easier than the last. The Norse believed that spring was a time of renewal, rebirth, and the return of life to a world that had been temporarily dead. They celebrated with festivals, feasts, and ceremonies designed to welcome back the light and warmth that made human civilization possible. They understood that surviving winter wasn't just a physical accomplishment. It was a spiritual victory over forces that wanted them dead. And as you sit by your fire on one of the first truly warm evenings of the year, listening to the sounds of life returning to the world around you, you might understand something that modern people rarely experience: the deep, bone-level satisfaction that comes from having faced impossible odds and somehow managed to survive. You've been tested by cold, hunger, darkness, and isolation, and you're still here. You've earned your place in this harsh landscape through months of suffering and endurance. Of course, you'll have to do it all again next year, and the year after that, and every year until you die, or finally decide that maybe moving somewhere warmer isn't such a bad idea after all. But for now, tonight, you've won. You've beaten winter at its own game, and spring is your prize. Welcome to Viking Norway, where survival isn't an adventure, it's the only skill that matters, where every day is a negotiation with death, and every season that passes is a victory worth celebrating. Where the aurora borealis isn't just beautiful, it's a reminder that you live at the edge of the world, in a place so hostile to human life that just existing here makes you tougher than most people can imagine. Sweet dreams, wanderers. And perhaps, as you drift off in your warm, comfortable beds, spare a thought for those ancestors who earned their rest the hard way by surviving another day in a world that never stopped trying to kill them.